Hello and welcome to this session at FOSI 2020 conference and this fascinating session ahead on international trends and policy. We all know that countries around the world have taken very different approaches to confronting challenges and opportunities presented by our ever more connected lives. But we're incredibly lucky that we've been joined today by some of the best global experts who are happy to let us know what they think has worked and what must be improved. We also plan to talk about best practices and have a peek at future plans. This is clearly a really international panel from London, Sydney and Luxembourg, but I just realised we're very British heavy. I'm Keaney Richards, I'm the head of the Aspen Institute in the UK, to add to the number of Brits here. We're going to kick off by asking everyone that you can see in front of me about the best practices in their work. Julia, I thought we could kick off with you as you're furthest away in Sydney, and as it's 4 a.m, I thought I could help you spark some adrenaline rather quickly. Let me just introduce you. Dr. Julia Fossi from Sydney is the Director of International Strategy and Futures of the eSafety Commissioner. It's Australia's independent regulator for online safety and the world's first government agency solely dedicated to tackling online abuse. Julia leads the eSafety's Safety by Design initiative, which provides advice, and she provides advice on emerging online safety issues and challenges, and carries out tech trends analysis. Julia, thank you so much for joining us. We're really keen to hear about the eSafety Commission and some of the legislation that's been introduced. So please do fill us in.
Thank you very much, Penny, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's joining today. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to FOSI for inviting the eSafety Commissioner. So the eSafety Commissioner, as Penny has said, is Australia's independent regulator for online safety with a really powerful combination of functions. Now, these range from prevention through awareness raising, education, research, best practice, to early intervention and harm remediation through kind of multiple statutory regulatory schemes that give eSafety the power to rapidly remove cyberbullying, image-based abuse and illegal online content. Now, this really broad remit really enables eSafety to address online safety in a multifaceted and holistic manner. So you can really describe our work into three main buckets. That kind of prevention work, and that's really kind of heavily based on that awareness raising, that education, and we provide really kind of targeted advice and resources and guidance to different kind of elements of the community, ranging from children and young people all the way through to seniors. And then we've got bespoke kind of programs of work that really focus on women in particular and at-risk communities. The second pillar is on protection, and that's where our regulatory schemes fit in. Now, the three reporting schemes that I mentioned just a moment ago operate under a singular investigatory division, and these schemes really offer Australians practical help and managing the impact that these harms can have, the impact of cyberbullying, image-based abuse, and exposure to prohibited or potentially prohibited online content. But their real uniqueness lies in the fact that eSafety can formally direct certain online service providers to remove content from their services. And this really empowers victims of online abuse to take control and helps reduce harm and re-victimization. Now, the schemes largely operate as a cooperative model between government and industry, but we do have powers available to us to compel the removal of material, and that provides a real critical safety net to compel industry to be proactive in addressing online harms. And then that third pillar is in relation to proactive change, and that's just the fact that we recognise that as a regulator working in the online space, we need to be flexible, and nimble, and we need to be kind of forward thinking. So that is where all of our environmental and horizon scanning, where we kind of look to kind of technologies and in the hope that we can anticipate where harms may exist and try to mitigate that either through engagement with industry or through kind of education and on our other resources. And that's where our project Safety by Design fits in, which is an initiative that eSafety has been pushing since 2018, 2018, and that's really trying to embed user safety into the design, development and deployment of online services and platforms. But I'm sure I won't go into that at the minute, just so I'm conscious we've got to get through all the other speakers, but that's just a very broad overview of the eSafety model.
Thank you so much. You're right, we absolutely do want to come back to that, and I'm also very keen to ask you to address at some stage building a global consensus. But next I want to turn to June, who's based in Luxembourg, and June Lowery is the head of unit at the European Commission's Directorate General for Communications Networks, Content and Technology. Her current responsibilities include policy and programme management for web accessibility, and she also looks at multilingualism and language technology and online safety for children. June, it's great that you joined us today. Thank you so much. Are you able to tell us what you consider to be the best practice at the moment?
Well, hello everyone from Luxembourg, from a continent, not just an island like Australia and United Kingdom. Very nice to join you today. And since I'm representing the European Commission, which may not be so familiar to everyone, even including lots of people in Europe, a very quick word of introduction. So the European Union is really unique. 27 countries, which we call member states, 24 official languages. And I suppose it's similar but different to the setup in the States, where you have states and federal level in the USA. And you could think of the Commission perhaps as some sort of federal civil service. It's the best approximation I can come up with. So within the EU constellation, only the Commission can propose legislation, and it's the body that implements European policy, and that's really what my unit and my team does. So I think probably from all of us, we realise that it's the tone of the top that really matters in setting policy. And under this commission, which took office last year, we have for the first time a commissioner whose mandate explicitly includes the rights of children and the rights of children online. And so we're expecting a comprehensive EU strategy on the rights of children next year. We have policy tools, some similar to what Julia was mentioning. We have hard law, where we or the member states, we set either a minimum standard or we set a law which applies across the 27 countries. We have what we would call soft law, which can be things like codes of conduct, can be strategies, can be self-regulatory or co-regulatory initiatives, things like that. And then we also have funding programs, which is where really we implement the policy. And certainly in my unit, we have, on Safer Internet for Children, we have a mix of these, and we work with a very wide range of stakeholders, a wide range of people that we talk to and we work with on this. And really the elements I'd like to single out that I think are really best practice. We've had a comprehensive strategy since 2012, Safer Internet for Kids, and that it has stood the test of time. It really has been well conceived, a balance between empowerment and protection. We work, because of our very complex setup here in the European Union, we work with a network of what we call Safer Internet centres who exist at national level. And they work obviously in the national language or languages, and they're really our eyes and ears and our hands and feet on the ground. And they have three functions. So the awareness raising that Julia was mentioning, so preparing materials, going into schools, talking to target groups, all that great stuff. We offer free of charge helplines for anyone who's got a worry or a concern or needs information, whether that's a child or a parent or a teacher. You know, when should I first buy the phone to my child is being cyberbullied, or, you know, so we have really direct offer of help there. And we also have hotlines for the public to anonymously report what they suspect might be child sexual abuse material online, to have it removed as quickly as possible within an international network there. And the best of it, we could not do our work without those Safer Internet centres. And that network is really coordinated by a fantastic team in Brussels. And if you remember nothing else of what I say, I'm going to put a link in the chat. We have a great portal where we pull together all these different strands, the different languages, the different resources. The portal is called betterinternetforkids.eu. And that really is you see, there it is already in the chat. Someone must have been listening and paying attention. And whether you've never seen it before or you've seen it in the past, it's been revamped recently, and it really represents, I think, the best of Europe for protecting children online.
By the way, we will remember more than just that, but it's great to have that in the chat. Thank you. Matt, you're hovering, and I'm really looking forward to turning to you next. You're the Senior Policy Advisor in the UK's Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, DCMS, where you lead I'm sure what you do, but I'm just introducing you to others, where you lead the department's work on the scope of the new online harms regulatory framework and user redress advocacy. I hope you're keen to share some information with us on the forthcoming UK online harms legislation. I'm really looking forward to understanding a bit more about it.
Great, thank you, Penny. And yes, very happy to be here and to have been invited to the conference today. Thank you for having me. I, as Penny said, work within the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport in the UK government. On the whole for digital regulation and for promoting the digital economy. And one of our key priorities is to make the safest place in the world to be online. Some of you might know that last year we published a white paper, the Online Harms White Paper, which set out our plans for a new regulatory framework to try and tackle online harms online and taking particularly robust action to tackle the most serious illegal harms, including child sexual abuse and exploitation and terrorist content. We are currently still finalising the policy positions, but I thought I'd just share a little bit about kind of what our approach looks like and why we've taken that approach. But before that, maybe just a couple of facts around kind of why this is so important to us. We've seen in recent years an increasing number of harm occurring to children and concerns about harm, and that obviously will not be news to anyone at today's conference. In the most recent research, which Ofcom, our communications regulator in the UK, carried out, they found out that only 56% of 12 to 15-year-olds feel safe when they go on social media, so really only just over half of children. And a quarter had experienced bullying online in the past year. And there's a growing number of parents who feel that the risks of the internet actually outweigh the benefits. So for us, this isn't just a question around keeping children safe, which is of paramount importance, but it's also about ensuring that those children can thrive and that they can benefit from digital technologies and from everything the internet has to offer, and that those benefits are shared widely and that they're shared fairly. So our plans are to introduce a new duty of care on services which host user-generated content and enable user interaction. This is a broad scope and goes broader than just kind of sector-specific, like social media or something, and has been specifically designed with that in mind in order to prevent the risk of harm kind of migrating from one platform to another. And what's I think really key around our duty of care, which we've proposed, is that it focuses on systems and processes rather than taking a kind of content first approach with notice and takedown measures. It focuses on getting companies to take more responsibility for their users' safety and to implement systems and processes which keep users safe online, empower users, and empower third parties, things like civil society organizations and charities and so on, to better tackle online harms and keep users safe online. This will be a statutory framework based in legislation and with tough enforcement powers for companies who don't comply with the legislation. But we also have a number of kind of voluntary and non-legislative initiatives in train, which I hope we'll be able to have a chance to talk about, including on safety by design, as well as on building a world-leading safety tech market to ensure that companies have access to the technology and the tools they need to be able to keep users safe online, whether they're small or large. But I'm sure we can go into that in more detail during the discussion.
I promised to ask you about it. Thank you, Matt. And the fourth Brit on the panel, but not the least, is Emily Keaney, the Director of Domestic Regulatory Strategy at the Informationers Commission office in the UK, where she is responsible for leading their domestic strategy and policy development. She's in charge of overseeing the implementation of the Age-Appropriate Design Code, and previously was the director of the UK Regulators Network, a vehicle for collaboration, which is a perfect reason that I think you're on the panel today talking about collaboration. Emily, I'm keen a lot actually to hear more about the UK's approach to keeping young people safe online and the age-appropriate design code. Is that what you consider best practice to be?
Thanks very much, Penny, and really lovely to be here. And also, before I was at the UK Regulators Network, I ran Ofcom's children's research, so great to hear Matt quoting that research. I always love to see that that's still being used to help inform policy. So yes, I am now at the Information Commissioner's office. That's the UK's data protection regulator. And our job is to uphold information rights in the public interest, promote openness by public bodies, and data privacy for individuals. The Age-Appropriate Design Code is, yes, it's what we think it is a good example of best practice. It is a statutory code of practice for online services, it covers a wide range of different services, apps, online games, websites, social media sites, that are likely to be accessed by children. And that wording, I think, is really important, because one of the reasons we think the code is an example of best practice is because it very deliberately targets services that we know children use, not just services that are designed for children. And that was because we wanted children to be protected where they are online, not kind of put in a kind of walled garden or created where there are certain spaces that are okay for them to go and the rest is a bit of a Wild West. So that's one of the reasons why we thought that was important. It is a statutory code. What that means is that it is our more detailed description of what we think organisations need to do to comply with the law, so the UK Gdpr. So it was, we were required to put the code together by Parliament. It completed its parliamentary passage in autumn. The 12-month transition period began in September. So we are in the process of working with organisations across the UK to help them understand what they need to do to conform with the code. And I think that's another reason why we would say that it is good practice, because we are working really closely both with big and small organisations to help them understand what the code means for them, to make sure that we're providing the kinds of tools and support and advice that they need to put it into practice, and that reflects the wide variety of ways in which children's data is used. The code kind of ensures that children's data is protected, and it also recognises that we need to do that in a way that reflects the fact that children have different needs at different ages. So it, for instance, a good example of that is that it talks about the use of parental controls, making sure that those are effective, but that as children get older, because the code goes all the way up to children up to the age of 18, that it's also important that children are aware and that there's some kind of signal that their online use is being monitored by their parents in some way. And I think the reason that's worth sort of thinking about is because it's that balance between ensuring children are protected, but also recognising that children as they get older need some of that autonomy and control. So it contains a wide range of standards. I think there's 13 standards about how organisations need to treat children's data. It takes a data protection by design and default approach. So that means that organisations need to think from the start about how they design in good practice when they are thinking about the kinds of data that they collect, about the ways in which they inform children about that, and about the ways in which they process that data. And it also asks organisations to consider the best interests of the child when designing their services. So that means they have to provide information about how children's data is collected and are used in a way children find accessible and can understand. They need to provide privacy settings that are hide by default, including geolocation switched off, and refrain from using nudge techniques to encourage children to give up more personal data. So there's lots in there. We can come back to sort of the detail, either the detail of the code or the detail of how we're working with organisations to put it into practice. But we think it's a good example of taking a child-centred approach to these kinds of things.
Emily, thank you so much. Thank you. I just wanted to remind people watching that you're very welcome to put questions either to Emily or the others. But in the meantime, I just want to ask you a few questions while we wait for those questions to come in, because I'm fascinated. Very simple question, and I presume that the answer isn't as simple as the question. I'd love to hear from all of you what you think the key elements are of any online safety legislation. What should they be, and what are they? I don't know whether it's fair of me just to sort of ask someone to jump in. June.
I'll jump in then. And well, I think first of all, you have to be clear. I think it sounds, which actually is much more complicated when it comes to legislation, where we often have this tension between freedom of expression and safety, empowerment and protection. Trying to find a balance between that is not an easy job, as I think we probably all agree and we've all experienced. In terms of EU law, we have a system, I'm not so familiar with the others, where we have a whole list of recitals, trying to explain what's the kind of context, what's the aims of the act before you actually get to the text itself. So that really helps people to understand. And sorry, I've got an echo. I'll keep talking, I hope that's okay, but I'll try and turn myself to keep my earphones in. And certainly with EU legislation, as Matt's described also for the UK, we have a very wide public consultation beforehand. So we try and hear, and that's a statutory part of our legislative process, so that really stakeholders get the chance to contribute to that. We have to take that into account. We have to have impact assessments. And what's becoming increasingly important, and it's something that I've seen more under this commission, but I think is really something that's going to be mainstreamed more, is actually youth participation. Because I really think that we cannot, we oldies cannot rule on children's lives, their present and their future, when we have not grown up as digital natives. And I think that's so important, that we should be learning from young people who are facing these opportunities and are living this in a way that we have never, that our children are so different, it's not comparable. So I think those are some of the elements, at least, to make a target, legislation actually successful. Thank you.
That makes a huge amount of sense to me. Thank you. Are there any gaps that anyone feels could be filled in?
I might just pick up firstly on what June said around kind of involving people and young people. I think is completely correct, and I think I noticed that this conference itself has a panel with young people. I think that's exactly the kind of thing we need more of. I'm not that old yet, and I see platforms daily that I've never heard of that the kids are using, that when I was at school a decade and a bit ago didn't even exist, and probably the founders of them are probably still in school as well. And it just shows kind of how quickly things do change, and why it's so important to bring in the people who are using platforms day in and day out. I'd also just like to pick up on June's point around kind of clarity and certainty that I think is so important to provide for organizations about are they subject to regulation, how do they know, what are they expected to do, and how do they know if they're doing that correctly. Our legislation, or the duty of care, which will be established through our legislation, will be backed by codes of practice, and we're really keen to make sure that provides certainty for companies to know what they're meant to be doing and what's expected of them. And the other thing linked to that is, I think, around proportionality. the approach we've taken, as I mentioned, is very broad in terms of the services and scope. We're not targeting a particular sector or a particular type of service, and so that brings in a large range from the largest platforms to smaller businesses. Sorry, I'm just going to interrupt. Someone's decided to do DIY upstairs, so if you can hear banging, I'm very sorry. It's just kind of, it might not be coming through my headphones, but so proportionality is hugely important. That we can't have a one-size-fits-all approach for the largest platforms that's the same as for a small platform or a startup which is seeking to grow and to maybe become the next large platform. So we need to make sure that we're being proportionate while also being clear, and that is a challenge, but it's something where we do have a lot of good practice to draw upon, and where we are very committed to making sure we're achieving our aims there.
Thank you, that's great. Emily,
I was just going to echo the point about involving children, and we did research with children as part of the development of the code, and we'll continue to engage with children as we come nearer to the end of the transition period. But I think that also the point about the wide range of different kinds of organisations that you need to ensure that can comply with the legislation is really important, and it actually takes a huge amount of work and engagement with those organisations to ensure they understand, firstly, whether it applies to them in the first place, and then if they do, to understand what that means for them, given that they will have different business models, they will have different ways in which they use data or engage with children or communities, and provide them with the kind of reasonably easy tools to use that are appropriate to the sort of scale of their organisation and make sense to them, so that they don't have to wade through pages and pages and pages and pages, which is kind of fine if you're a lawyer who's getting paid to advise on that. It's much more difficult if you're a small or micro organisation. So ensuring that we give organisations the support they need to put this in practice is important too.
And just a final thing from me, echoing, what the others have said. Total agreement in terms of, that it's essential to kind of, get the views from a diverse range as possible. From children, young people, but also from the at-risk kind of groups specifically, and the need for kind of legislation not to be too kind of prescriptive and to be future-proofed, because we've seen so many pieces of legislation that cater for the here and now, but the world is changing, particularly the online space is changing so rapidly. It's just to make sure that terminologies and definitions aren't restricted to what is currently in existence, because it can explode. So it's just that really kind of careful crafting of language expectations. Yeah, and like I said, the legislation, not being prescriptive, and that should sit elsewhere, either in explanatory kind of memorandum, code of practice, whatever the country in a jurisdiction is using.
Thank you, Julia. It's interesting. I was looking at the eSafety Commission's website, and I was fascinated how you identified people with low digital literacy rates as being very vulnerable, and also women in particular who are vulnerable as domestic abuse and having access to online. How do you go about corralling them to help inform your policies? I mean, surely that's really hard, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've got specific programs of work, like I've said, we have dedicated teams that are really kind of focused on these specific groups, and we do a huge amount of consultation, stakeholder engagement, and kind of collaboration. And the ethos of eSafety is really, we're here with community for community. So it's important for us to kind of co-develop, programs of work to ensure that we're listening to the needs on the ground. And I think, our model, having the investigatory and complaint schemes, really helps inform our practice, because we've constantly got incoming information and data in terms of what people are experiencing, where they're experiencing it, and then our outreach kind of programs. We've got ears on the ground everywhere that really kind of feeds in, and then we have our in-house research team. Everything that we do is based on kind of evidence-based and kind of research, and so that really kind of helps inform all of our work and ensure that we're kind of implementing and then evaluating our programs to ensure that they are impactful and effective.
Thank you. Really fascinating. This is something that June mentioned a few minutes ago, the balance between safety, security and privacy. That I think is always very hard to sort of get that balance correct. And Matt, I'm interested to think what you think can be done to the systems and processes approach to protect freedom of expression. Is there always going to be a conflict between the two, or is there something that can mitigate that?
I think it's always a challenge. I think there's on the one hand kind of safety and security, there's freedom of expression, privacy, non-discrimination, a whole kind of host of different things to bear in mind. And often I think they do, there is tension at the very least, if not always conflict, but I do feel that sometimes framing them as kind of safety versus freedom of expression in quite binary terms is not always as constructive as it could be. I think, in fact, the proposals we have, we hope that actually will increase the kind of right to expression for a lot of people who currently are silenced online, who currently don't feel they can voice their opinions, who are scared of posting things because they might be attacked by trolls and so on. So I think it's a very nuanced discussion, definitely. On the question of systems and processes, that's a really kind of key part of the duty of care, which we'll be establishing through the online harms legislation. The regulator within our regime won't be looking at specific pieces of content. Users will be able to share pieces of content or share their concerns with the regulator as part of its kind of horizon scanning and evidence gathering work. But the regulator won't be kind of responding to specific pieces of content or ordering takedown of specific pieces of content. And we think that's really important in terms of ensuring that companies have responsibility for the content, but also ensuring freedom of expression and ensuring that companies have, with regard to legal content in particular, have the right to kind of be clear about what's acceptable on their services, and to enforce that consistently and transparently, and to empower users in which platforms they use. But yeah, I think it's always challenging. Whether it's always in conflict, I'm not sure.
Probably being a little too binary. I'm interested in whether everyone else feels the same. Julia?
I think it's a false dichotomy, and I think these privacy, safety and security are three legs of the same stool, and they should always be balanced against each other kind of equally, and it's incredibly unhelpful. And I think unfortunately safety has been the poor relation kind of historically in that triad, and that was really why eSafety kind of generated its Safety by Design project, because we really wanted to lift up and leverage safety as an equal partner that should be considered alongside and with privacy and security. And I think it's a dangerous and it's polarizing, and I think I think we just need to be open and transparent as governments, as industry, and as kind of NGOs in terms of how things work. And I think once things are fully explained, I think a lot of concerns in relation to online safety and the technologies that are used are based on the fact that people don't necessarily understand how they work in practice and the detail of that. And I think once we start kind of opening up and explaining things in more detail, then we can really start having these nuanced discussions and debates. And we should always be discussing this to ensure that we are keeping everything in check. And that's where, eSafety works very collaboratively with the privacy information kind of privacy office here in Australia to ensure that balance and the security are kind of held in check.
Thank you. I'm really keen, we haven't got long, and I know that there's quite a lot of questions coming in. So I'm really keen to talk about international collaboration. And I'm really keen to hear what the four of you think, whether it's a pipe dream that we can have greater sort of global harmonization in policy and legislation. Is it a pipe dream, or do you think at some stage there might be some international treaty that reflects the work that you're doing in individual countries, or in June's case in one section? I don't know who wants to jump in first.
Maybe I'll start.
I'm an utter
No, go on, Julia. Go on, Julia.
No. I'm just a complete optimist, and I think we will get there. I think the tide has turned. I think we've reached a critical mass where people kind of really, this is at the forefront of everybody's minds. I think the first step, as the eSafety Commissioner, we hope that there will be a network of eSafety commissioners around the world that we can do just like the data protection. And I think having that kind of unified global kind of perspective, but a lot of our kind of international engagement work at eSafety is to try to secure this, harmonization and to avoid a fragmentation of online safety governance, regulation, and kind of ethics, because I think that leads us down quite a dangerous kind of path. And I think international and national collaboration and multi-stakeholder engagement has never been more critical as it is now. And I just think all of these different jurisdictions, we've EU, UK here, we've been engaging with a lot of other jurisdictions around the world who are looking at the safety model as an example of kind of best practice and wanting to follow. I think the tide is shifting, and I'm incredibly hopeful, but I don't think it's regulation on its own that can do this. I think there's other kind of pathways, as well, to do that.
June.
But June.
Yes, no, not at all. I just wanted to say that I think pipe dream or not, I think it's the only way. I think we have to and I think actually there's always more that unites us than divides us. I mean, working in the EU for 25 years nearly, there are some days where I think it's amazing that anything works, but it does, and it has worked for, nearly 60 years now. And that is total international cooperation, supranational cooperation, even really pooling sovereignty to actually try and find a compromise solution. And it isn't always easy, and it isn't always, that there's an easy path, and there are compromises, there are cultural differences, data privacy and freedom of expression, and the EU really are aware of some of these tensions there, but I think it's the only way, and I'm actually a bit like Julia, actually very optimistic about that. And I think beyond the EU, we also work hard internationally. There are forums also for discussing at international levels. I think we're on the board of the Commission's on the board of the We Protect Global Alliance, and for crimes that are international or for problems that are international, obviously child sexual abuse, child sexual exploitation, the online dimension of that being an absolute, a horrific example of that. We have to work internationally. There's just no outside of our national borders, and in our case, outside of our EU borders. There's no alternative.
I'm sure that's right. And I'm going to jump in before Matt and Emily does, because I'm aware we only have a few minutes to chat amongst ourselves before I'm going to pose you some questions from the audience. But if I could just have one more question about international cooperation. I'd like to know what it looks like tangibly. Are we talking about just a coalition of the willing, or are we talking about something that's much more sort of hardcore and constructed, like an international internet union? What does it substantially look like if we're having proper global cooperation? Matt, oh, sorry, Emily, I think you jumped in. Please go ahead.
I was just going to mention the GPA, the Global Privacy Assembly, which I think is a really good. It's looking at these issues from a privacy perspective, but it is a really good example of what that looks like tangibly. And lots of countries working together, working groups, subgroups, working papers, you know, so actually it looks like quite a lot of hard thinking and collaboration often, and the GPA have got a working group focused particularly on children's privacy and children's rights. So often it looks quite similar to working on these issues within an organisation, just on a much bigger scale. And I'm with the others that I'm very optimistic about the fact that this is the global direction of travel. Obviously, it takes time, but it's definitely where people are going, I think.
Yeah.
I'm
if
so
I can
glad
maybe
to hear
just
your enthusiasm and optimism. Sorry, June, were you going to say?
Yeah, no, sorry, could I just compliment that and say that exactly? I mean, obviously we're here in the EU, but there's also great work going on, you know, in Council of Europe, the ITU, part of the UN, OECD, for example. A lot of these organizations, international organizations, are also looking at children's rights issues in different international constellations. So there's a lot of good work going on there.
That's encouraging, thank you. I'm actually going to jump to questions now, only because I want to take the chair's prerogative and set you a question at the end, just for the hell of it. There's one from Hallway Ali, and he's asking about data protection and privacy law. He says, how do we ensure that companies follow the Children's Best Practice Code? What enforcement mechanisms exist? Matt, you haven't spoken, so am I allowed to jump in first?
So I can talk about, I guess, enforcement under a regulatory framework that is to come. Emily might be able to talk about enforcement under what already exists. So I think it's really important that to be able to ensure that companies and services are complying with regulation, that we do have tough enforcement powers, and the UK government has been clear that we do. There are definitely challenges around kind of how you enforce that in such an international and global context, and that's something which we've done a lot of consultation on and are continuing to think about. But I guess the simple answer to the question is that yes, tough enforcement action is needed. That will include fines, as we set out in the white paper, and we also consulted on further enforcement measures such as business disruption measures and, as a last resort, kind of blocking of websites, and are still kind of finalising our thinking on that.
Emily, do you want to jump in about
Yeah, so specifically on the age appropriate design code, as a regulator, we have quite a wide range of possible enforcement measures that we can take. So we can do proactive audits, we can serve stock processing notices, we can issue fines, and we can take complaints both from individuals and from civil society. So we have quite a range of tools. We are still, for the code, in the 12-month transition period. And I actually also think it's worth, as a regulator, us always bearing in mind that although we do have that range of tools and we are committed to using them where appropriate, actually some of our most effective tools are also in our sort of convening, advising, encouraging type role as well. So working with organisations to make sure they understand what they need to do, make sure they understand why it's important, and provide guidance and information in a way that's accessible. So we've got that very wide range, and I think all of those are important. We're very much in the working with organisations to make sure they know about it and understand what they have to do phase during the transition period. But we will then be moving into thinking about how we do things like proactive audits once that transition period is finished.
Thank you. I was going to ask Julia and June whether they can give us any examples of code of conducts that actually work. June.
Yeah, sure. Yes, I mean, as we've been talking, it's not just law, but there is a place also for self-regulation, co-regulation. Within the EU, we have two perhaps relevant codes of conduct, code of practice. We have a code of conduct on illegal hate speech, which has been in existence for around 4 years now. I think it's 2016 it came in. And actually that's been, I wouldn't say surprising. I think we're all happy with the results of that. Certainly wasn't easy to start with. I think probably success factor is that there is a very clear definition of what is illegal hate speech, and so it's easy for companies to also respect that. It's really grounded in legislation and not just a nice to have thing on top of that. And I think the other success factor there has really been regular monitoring and transparency. So the companies have, they've signed up to it and they've been held account to the commitments that they've made in the code. And that I think has proved very successful and actually a real win-win for both sides. And I think the latest evaluation, the latest report on that has been very positive as well. And based on that model, we've now got a code of practice, I think it's called on disinformation, which is obviously becoming increasingly important in the times of COVID, taking on a whole new dimension as well. And that's very recent, just sort of been set up within the last year, but we're quite optimistic that that also will prove its value, although obviously as things are changing with vaccination, I know that it's very much in the discussion at the moment whether a self-regulation code of practice is sufficient enough at the moment for things like that. Where credit's due, the industry really have changed their models, and especially in COVID, and we see with this illegal hate speech, they really have stepped up to the mark and actually changed their practices to really address those issues.
It's really encouraging. Thank you. Julia, is anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, this isn't a code of practice, and I think our legislation, we do have the the civil and the criminal kind of penalties, but actually we very, very rarely use that. And as Emily kind of pointed out, a lot of our work and success rate has been that kind of great kind of collaboration and kind of working with industry, to take down the content before we need even to get to kind of utilizing those. But I do want to kind of mention the Safety by Design initiative here, which isn't a code of practice, but is a separate piece of work that we've been kind of carrying out. And that's to encourage, assist, and support industry to ensure that they are embedding safety into the design, development, and deployment of their services. So back in 2019, we developed a set of Safety by Design principles, and that was done collaboratively with industry, with children and young people in particular. We have a youth vision statement on our website that really clearly articulates their needs and expectations, the NGO and advocacy community, as well as the general kind of population. So this was a really kind of multi-stakeholder approach that clearly sets out, kind of expectations of what kind of safety processes and systems need to be put into place. We talk about it as having the infrastructure and the scaffolds in place that industry need to comply. And we're currently developing an assessment tool for industry, both for startups and for mid to top tier companies, that translate these principles into implementation and action. And the support that we've received from industry, the positive feedback that we've received globally, on this is a global initiative. It's not just here in Australia, and it's really been developed with industry, kind of for industry. And I think having both that kind of regulatory approach and that kind of guidance, support, and encouragement, we see Safety by Design as a catalyst for innovation, a catalyst for change in the online safety space. So I think having both of those kind of aspects, be it a code of practice or a more innovative initiative like Safety by Design, I think that you need to have both of those to support
that makes sense.
progress.
There's a question for June here from Max Blaileben. The EU's 2-year report on progress on GDPR was published in June, and it talked about the benefits of harmonising the digital age of consent across the EU. He's asking whether there is any actual effort to amend the law to set up a single age of consent.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm sure if anyone who's followed this discussion over the years, whichever one I say, it'll be wrong, but say the original proposal was 16 to have a minimum age of consent, a bit like in America where you have the 13 age, then it got changed, and now it's a mess. It's messy, but that's the EU in action. It's a compromise, and it was respecting cultural differences and the views of the member states. I think as Max has said, there has been a review. I think it's still quite early, and I think the conclusions of that review that it was really too soon to actually propose a change to the legislation. legislation, but there will be another review, I think, in another 2 years, and that there are recommendations there that will be taken into account and will be discussed. But I think it was a very, very there was a real fault line there in terms of the age of consent, and I don't honestly see it changing, certainly not in the immediate future.
Thank you. FOSI released research this morning on parental controls. One finding is that parents are overwhelmed when it comes to kids' online behaviour. How do the four of you think that governments can conduct educational outreach efforts to inform parents and families about online safety and the law? I gather from the conversations we've already had that this is taking place, but again, it'd be really interesting to hear some best practices and where you are. Emily.
I guess on the code, one of the reasons that we took the approach we did, where we put accountability with organisations, was because we really recognised that parents found this overwhelming, and it's also the reason why the code specifies that this applies to services likely to be accessed by children, because we want it to be applied in the places that children are, and parents not to have to worry about, is this service okay and is this not? So part of the approach to the code does recognise that it is really hard. I'm also a parent. I know about all of this stuff. I still find it really hard. In terms of governments, and this is something we're thinking hard about as we connect with children, in terms of governments doing this, I actually think where the approach is taken, that you are working through the organisations, the civil society groups, the charities, the stakeholders that already have the relationships with children and with parents and with schools, it's much more effective than government trying to do it by itself. So it has to be done in partnership, and I think, you know, the online safety networks that June mentioned are a really good example of that working well, and it's something that I sort of learnt through when I was at Ofcom as well, is you reach people when you're working with the organisations who already have those relationships.
Thank you. I'm aware we've only got a few minutes left, so is anyone wanting to talk about that as well, or can I ask something else?
I just kind of add very quickly, completely agree around working with organisations who already have links. The Home Office, who are who we work very closely with on online harms legislation, recently did a campaign on kind of protecting on tackling child sexual exploitation online, and that involved really close collaboration with the NSPCC, which is the leading kind of UK charity for child safety, and directed, so using kind of the power and reach of government, but directing people to support from the NSPCC, which is a very well respected and very well known organisation here in the UK. So using that partnership to reach parents and children is hugely important.
Thank you. Really limited time left. I'm very keen to ask one last question of the four of you. We've been talking a lot about safety and legislation. Is it possible, do you think, to go beyond safety and legislate for children and others to not just be safe online, but to also flourish online? Is there a role for legislation there, or is that me just being too fanciful? There you go. Hard question to finish.
Sorry, Matt, go ahead.
So I would just say, like June said, we in terms of multinational cooperation, we don't have a choice. We need to find a way in which these technologies allow children to flourish. We know that they can. We know that they come with so many benefits for all of us, and you know, it's not a coincidence that the UK government wants the UK to be the safest place in the world to be online, but we also want everyone in our society to be able to benefit from the technology, from what technology can offer. So I think it's not a question of can we or will it happen, but it's a question of it has to happen. How can we make it happen? And I think what we've heard today is kind of the starting point of much of that, but there's a lot more to do.
Fantastic, thank
Absolutely.
you. June or Julia, do you just want to jump in and talk about your we've literally got a minute left. So.
Oh, so I'll try and take 30 seconds. Totally agree. I think we have to, if we want to have confident and competent digital citizens, then we need to give children the confidence now to actually get the benefits of the digital world. And we all know that this year we would never have managed without digital world. So, you know, let's give, you know, thanks that we live now when we do and where we do, that we have access to all these benefits. But we have to sort of make the environment just to give children the space to flourish, really, because the content is there and they will make, you know, they'll take it and run with it, but we just have to let them do that.
What a lovely thought to finish. Thank you so much. Emily, Juliet, June, Matt, huge thanks. And thanks to Fossi for bringing the dream team together. What an absolutely fascinating hour. Thank you so much. And I understand, by the way, there is now a break for those watching. So please feel free to digitally wander to, I can see things, networking and expos. So just enjoy that. But I've loved learning from you and listening to you. And thank you so much.
Been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the day, everyone.
Likewise.